Welcome back to week 5 of God Never Gives Up on You. The last 4 weeks have been quite a whirlwind of drama, and the only real way to describe what Jacob's life has been like so far is that it is a hot mess. And that's a technical theological term in case you were wondering. But this week, it marks a turning point. You see, Jacob has now been with his uncle Laban for 20 years. He worked for 7 to marry who he thought was Rachel, but turned out to be her sister Leah. And then he worked 7 more to marry Rachel, and then he had spent 6 years working the flocks and fields of his uncle. And these 20 years had led Jacob into a rough spot. You're going to read more of the specifics of this in your growth group today, but just for the sake of an overview, God had promised to be with Jacob. And what that resulted in was that as long as Jacob was with Laban, Laban was experiencing the benefits of God's blessings on Jacob. A time came, though, when Jacob wanted to go home. Remember, he was going to be the heir of his father's estate, and he was feeling like it was time for his wives and 12 kids to go back home, and the kids could meet grandma and grandpa, and he could claim his rightful place as the heir of his father Isaac's considerable fortune. Laban knew that that meant his days of champagne and caviar were coming to an end, so he tried to make a deal with Jacob to get him to stay. He basically said, "Name your price. What's it going to take to keep you here?" And this is where it starts to get tricky. Every time Jacob and Laban would make a deal as to how Jacob should be getting paid, Laban would do something to try and make it so that Jacob would lose out and Laban would gain. Laban was taking advantage of Jacob. For example, Jacob would say, "You can pay me with all the spotted animals in the flock." And immediately Laban would say, "Great." But then before Jacob could claim his payment, Laban would send all of the spotted animals to go be a part of his other son's flocks. But even though Laban would do his best to swindle Jacob, God would work things out for Jacob's benefit. So with the example that we just gave, even though Laban would remove Jacob's payment, God would make all the newborn animals spotted so that they would become Jacob's. This sort of thing went on for a while, each time leading Laban to renegotiate the terms until Laban's sons started to feel like Jacob was taking all of their wealth. They grew resentful. Well, Jacob perceived that Laban and his sons were having a change of heart toward him, and one night God came to him in a dream and said, "Go back to the land your fathers and your relatives, and I will be with you." Jacob met with his wives in secret and told them his plans to leave, and they gathered up all that was rightfully Jacob's and slipped away in secret. But before they left, Rachel stole her father's household idols. Now Laban wasn't having any of it, so he gathered his men and he set out in pursuit. And this is where we see the faithfulness of God. Just as Laban caught up to Jacob, God came to Laban in a dream. This is how Laban describes it. Laban said to Jacob, "You've done a foolish thing. I have power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you've gone off because you long to return to your father's household, but why did you steal my gods?" Laban's making it clear that he could have overtaken Jacob and harmed him. But God intervened on his behalf, and after a confusing altercation over Laban's household idols that doesn't really have an honest conclusion, Laban and Jacob make an agreement with each other, and Jacob heads home to the land of his family. God saves Jacob. It's as easy as that. And this brings us to an important shift in Jacob. He is no longer swindling and manipulating his way into getting what he wants. He starts to trust in God's provision and come by things honestly. In each one of the agreements with Laban, Jacob holds up his end of the deal. And even though he ran from Laban in secret when God had promised to be with him, we start to see Jacob talk more and more about God. In fact, In the verses from our story today, God is mentioned by Jacob more than anywhere else in Jacob's story thus far. This is a huge deal, and something that we often see in our lives as well. It's in our hardest times that God is developing our character. Laban treated Jacob about as poorly as could be, and constantly changing the terms of Jacob's employment, tricking him into marrying Leah, trying to steal what was owed to him. But God is using these circumstances to shape, inform, and mold Jacob. The presence of difficulties doesn't mean the absence of God. Instead, God often uses those really hard times to shape us. God was fully committed to Jacob even during those really hard years, even when it seems like Jacob was not committed to him. And that's the thing to see. God was still working in Jacob's life, even when the circumstances make it seem like he wasn't, because God never gives up on us. And God is working in your circumstances, even when it seems like he isn't. We'll see you next week.